Céline Bessière is professor of sociology at the University of Paris-Dauphine and member of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Research in Social Science. Her latest research focuses on the economics and legal dimension of the family, inheritance, marital separation, organization of household economies, division of labor between spouses, and so on. Sibylle Gollac is Researcher Fellow in Sociology at the French National Center for Scientific Research at Center for Sociological and Political Research in Paris. Her research focuses on social mobility and the importance of wealth in the way class and gender-based social relations are reproduced within the family, combining ethnographic approach and statistical analysis. Sibylle Gollac and Céline Bessière published together, first in French, Le genre du capital, comment la famille reproduit les inégalités, published by La Découverte in 2020, and translated this year in English, The Gender of Capital, How Family Perpetuate Wealth Inequality, by Howard University Press. It has been adapted this year too as a comic by Delcourt La Découverte. The extensive research on the distribution of wealth within the family, in particular through the analysis of inheritance and marital breakdown, has a considerable impact in French debate and international debates. Dear Celine and dear Sibylle, it is with great pleasure and thanks that I give you the floor.
So I'm Sibylle, it's Celine. So first of all, we would like to thank the Swiss Association for Gender Studies and the organizer of this conference for their invitation. We are very happy to present you our research and this book, recently translated by Juliette Rogers. The demonstration of our book starts from a double observation. First, wealth inequality between families has increased globally since the 1980s, even more than income inequality. In 2021, the wealthiest 10% owns more than 3/4 of global wealth, whereas the bottom 50% owns a mere 2%. In uncertain times, characterized by precarity in working and personal life, the ability of storing wealth has become a key defining feature of contemporary existence. Wealth inequality is becoming the main indicator of the widening gap between the super rich and the rest of society, and the lack of savings and assets a reliable measure of poverty. Wealth brings income and gives access to credit, self-employment, higher education, and housing. If one can afford the right address, home ownership is a mark of social distinction. Wealth is also crucial for living standards in the old age. Wealth contributes more and more to the definition of social position all over the life. There are two different ways of constituting wealth. First, by putting money aside, and second, by inheriting it. Inheritance represented 70% to 80% of the private wealth held by individuals in Europe until 1910s, but these levels then plummeted with the two world wars to 30–40% in the 1950s, 1980s. Only to rise again later. It's currently over 60%. We are certainly a long way from the 1910s, but if current economic and demographic trends continue, the inherited proportion of wealth will only increase over the 21st century. It's more and more difficult for individuals without inheritance to become members of the wealthier classes solely of their earnings from work. And inheritance is a family issue. This is self-evident in France, where we lead our research. The civil code and public financing favor wealth transfer to direct descendants. Children can't be disinherited, and the transfers they receive are only modestly taxed. The resurgence of inheritance is tantamount to a return of the family as a key actor in the economy, contributing to the socio-economic inequality and reinforcing the boundaries between families of different class and racial backgrounds. These family transfers, therefore, play a central role in the reproduction of social inequalities. Our second observation concerns a gender wealth gap. I think it's why we are here today. The distribution of wealth by gender has received increasing attention. This gender gap is still strong in many countries. However, documenting the gender distribution of assets is difficult because of the way information about individual ownership and control of assets is tangled together in different sex couples. Most of the data on wealth are collected at the level of the household, either through surveys or tax data. High-quality wealth surveys describing each member of household's individual ownership of assets are hard to come by, but there are two notable exceptions. The first is a German socio-economic panel study that measures a significant gender wealth gap in Germany, not only between single men and women, but also within unmarried and married couples. Since 1998, the French Wealth Survey has recorded, with varying degrees of accuracy, who owns the various assets in the household. Two economists, Nicolas Frémaux and Marion Le Turc, have conducted a study based on this survey, which shows that the gender wealth gap is widening in France. Between 1998 and 2015, the gender wealth gap almost doubled in France, from 9% of the population mean wealth to 16%. This increase concerns both singles and couples. Socioeconomic literature has explored, socioeconomic literature has explored three sets of explanations of the gender wealth gap. First, women and men have been found to have systematically different portfolio structures. They save and invest differently with diverging levels of return. Some economists consider that women are more risk-adverse than men. It will be tempting to link this difference to differentiated gendered socializations, but the question is, isn't it risky to interrupt one's career to take on domestic work without any guarantee of compensation in case of separation? The second and dominant explanation for us for the gender wealth gap is the gender division of labor that occurs both in the household and on the labor market. It's the main explanation of the wide gender wealth gap in Germany and its closing in the 2000s. In France, women still provide 2/3 of the domestic work. They earn 25% less than men, and a woman living in a couple, married or not, earns 42% less on average than her partner. And the more children they have, the wider this income gap is. A third explanation for the gender wealth gap insists on the legal frame in which men and women hold their assets, which depends on marital status transitions, and laws governing family and property. Many studies show that single-headed households accumulate less wealth than married households. There also exists a marital disruption penalty to wealth accumulation, especially for women. Laws governing marital property and divorce play an important part in gender wealth accumulation. In France, the standard default regime is the communauté de biens réduite aux acquets. It's a partial community property. Assets belonging to each prior to marriage or received as inheritance or a family gift after the marriage remain individually owned. But assets acquired by one or both after marriage belong to both equally. When the marriage is dissolved by the death of one partner or through legal separation, the community property is divided into equal shares. But in France, fewer couples in the younger generations are choosing to marry. In France today, partners tend to favor simple cohabitation or a civil union, which both leave asset management to the individuals. 60% of children are born out of wedlock. An increasing share of married couples, especially the wealthier ones, sign separate property contracts. Moreover, the number of marital breakdowns has stabilized at a high level, with a total divorce rate of 44 divorces for 100 marriages. As shown by Nicolas Frémaux and Marion Le Turc, these evolutions are part of a trend of individualization of wealth in France that contributes to the widening of the gender wealth gap. Individualization benefits men because division of labor remains and doesn't allow the same rate of wealth accumulation for men and women. Therefore, gender wealth gap is linked to the forms of marital unions and to the gender division of labor in different sex couples. To understand gender wealth gap, it's necessary to analyze what happens in the family. To do this, we first decided to focus our analysis on two crucial moments: the breakdown of a marriage or unmarried relationship, and estate planning and settlement. Second, we decided not to focus our analysis on the law in the book, but on the law in practice. In France, inheritance is supposed to be equally shared among daughters and sons since the Napoleonic Code in 804. Spouses are only formally treated in an equal way since 1985 in France. But now all mentions of husband and wife have disappeared from the civil code concerning assets. France has a gender-neutral law concerning asset ownership. We wanted to understand how inequality is perpetuated despite this formally equal law. Third, we try to hold an intersectional perspective. Certain social classes monopolize wealth and work to preserve it among themselves from one generation to the next, while other classes are persistently deprived of it. At the same time, women accumulate less wealth than men. Class inequality and gender inequality are intertwined. Our work is based first and foremost on the idea that the family is an economic institution. This is an idea that we take from Marxist and materialist feminists as Federici or Delphi, as well as from economic sociologists as Zelizer. First, the family produces wealth. If household production were to be taken into account, the GDP in 2010 would have been 33% larger in France. This invisible household production is largely carried out by women and for free. In France, among couples with children, women work on average 54 hours per week, 34 hours of unpaid housework, and 20 hours of professional activity. Within the same households, men work only 51 hours, 3 hours less per week. Men devote on average 18 hours per week to unpaid housework and 33 hours to professional activities. In the end, women work a bit more, but are paid much less. Do you remember? 42% less. This is one of the reasons for the gender wealth gap. But family also organizes wealth circulation, control, and evaluation to ensure its transmission from one generation to the next. Our work shows how these family economic arrangements don't lead to a redistribution of wealth between women and men, but on the contrary to the maintenance of wealth in the hands of men. This is true in wealthy families, but also in diverse social groups. How do we investigate family economic arrangements? First, we carried out in-depth family case studies based on repeated observations and interviews with groups of kin. We have followed some families for over 10 years. Because family case studies can't be used to research a large number of people, and because they make it difficult to compare different social classes, we combine them with statistics, particularly data arising from the French Household Wealth Survey. And estate planning and marital breakdowns are strictly legally codified. These are matters of family, fiscal, and civil law. Our research thus brought us into the offices of family practice lawyers and notaries and family courts. With a large research team, we observed meetings with clients and hearings. We interviewed legal professionals and built a database from 4,000 court files. Thanks to this collective fieldwork in the courts and among lawyers, we've been able to observe very different family situations in very different social groups, from very poor racialized single mothers to the 20th fortune of France or couples from the white international elites. Here is the team at work. As you can see, we had very different working conditions from one court to another. Sometimes we had an office especially for us, but sometimes we had to work in the basement where the files were stored. In most courts, family court hearings are held in the judges' offices. At the bottom of the slide here, it's a drawing of Jeanne Puchol from the graphic essay adaptation of our book. And you can see the judge, but most of the time it was a woman, and the clerk, who was a woman 100% of the time. You can see a researcher, our colleague, Hélène Steinmetz, but most of the time there were two of us. At the top of the slide, you can see Celine and I. My hair was shorter, and I had the glasses. But we are observing a meeting between a lawyer and her client, and usually one of us tried to write down everything that was said, and the other one will note what people looked like, what the offices looked like, if people looked sad, bored, angry, and things like that. But let's go back to what Celine and I observed in the families we surveyed. Unfortunately, I won't have time to tell you the story of the Renoir family who lives in this charming French village. But what do show family case studies? They show it's difficult to understand the economic arrangements observed in a particular family and the acceptance of those arrangements without analyzing family strategies of social reproduction. According to Pierre Bourdieu and Jean-Claude Passeron, reproduction describes those mechanisms that preserve social hierarchy over long periods. It describes in the same time the mechanism that determine the distribution of positions in that hierarchy within each generation. These mechanisms ensure that certain families have a monopoly on the most privileged class positions from generation to generation, while other families are trapped for the long term at the bottom of the social hierarchy. In daily life, individuals, parents, for example, establish family strategies that maintain or improve their kin's, and especially their children's social status. These family strategies of social reproduction can be of several types: marriage strategies, fertility strategies, estate planning, academic strategies, and so forth. In the 1960s, Bourdieu studied the farming society in southwestern France. He described the early choice of a male successor who will carry on the family's social status, pass on the name, and become the privileged heir to its wealth. We show how today in France, some families have assets that must be kept, that are more symbolically and economically important and preferentially passed along to sons. We call these assets structuring assets. The nature of these assets varies according to the family situation and social background. It can be an investment portfolio of stocks and bonds in the wealthiest families, a family business or professional property, a family home, a land. This masculine inheritance privilege is still visible within the overall population of France, even if contemporary families have to pass on economic and cultural capitals that are inextricably linked. In the Renoir family, it was the son, Jean-Paul, who inherited the clientele of his accounting parents, even though he was less educated than his two sisters. So he had to sell the office of his parents And it was the eldest grandson who went with his grandmother to the lawyer's office when the business was sold. His sister, Claire, here, tells me this. In Mom's family, boys are always favored over girls. So Jean-Paul is my grandmother's favorite son. We all agree on that. Just like Sylvain, her brother, was my mother's favorite son for a long time. It's just like Sally Claus. It's unbelievable. The Sally Claus was used to justify a ban on women ascending to the throne of France. So the French Household Wealth Survey permits some generalization. In 2015, for the children of the self-employed, inheritances and inter vivos gifts received by males are more often composed of professional assets than those received by females. The gap is even wider if compared between transfers to all daughters and transfers to first sons. I mean the first male among siblings. But these differences in the types of assets being transferred based on sex category and birth order don't only concern either small business families or professional assets. For all households, inter vivos gifts and inheritances destined for sons, and even more so for first sons, are significantly more likely to include real estate. The same is true for land and securities. Sons, and especially first sons, get priority for specific assets as opposed to the transfer of money. Thus, 49% of all estate transfers to daughters consist entirely of money, against similar transfer to 45% of sons and 43% of first sons. These differences can seem to be trivial differences. This is because statistics average out very different situations. In some families, all the children are male or female. Situations arise where there is no room to make choices in the inheritance, where all the assets are liquid, or where the only asset is a piece of real estate and nowhere can afford to buy out the others, and therefore it must be sold. The specific role of sons, and especially of first sons, manifests itself not only in the nature of the assets received, but in the timing of when they are transferred. Sons are more likely to receive their lot before daughters in the form of inter vivos gifts. These forms represent 33% of all estate transfers received by women, against 38% of those received by men. To receive such an endowment early in life is an obvious advantage in the further accumulation of wealth during a lifetime. Moreover, family case studies and statistical results show that among different sex couples, these unequal positions of husbands and wives within their families of origin, but also the age gap between spouses and the gender inequality of job markets all work together to confer on men greater economic and social power over their partners. The moment of separation reveals the economic inequality that are woven into different sex domestic relationships. It also amplifies pre-existing inequalities. Even today, the cost of breakdown is mainly paid by women. In the 2015 French Wealth Survey, being separated rather than in a couple greatly reduced the likelihood of being a homeowner, all other things being equal. But this correlation is significantly higher for women than it is for men. How can we explain the importance of this mechanism in a society in which the rights of female and male heirs and spouses are formally equal? Let's see now what's happening in lawyers' offices and family courts.
Okay, so next we enter the offices of legal professionals, where family economic arrangements are discreetly formalized in legal language and made official. Family members may meet various legal professionals who will help them to domesticate family and property law to an extent which depends on their social class. Legal counsel is divided into two professions in France, and both may be involved in family economic affairs depending on the complexity of a situation and the assets involved. These are notaries and family lawyers. So notaries, I will spend a bit of time on notaries because it's kind of specific and not so well known. So notaries are specialized in civil law countries like France in contracts and fiscal law, and are legally mandated to evaluate and distribute family assets. They draw up and settle wills, manage the transfer of deeds in property transactions, draft prenuptial agreements, oversee the liquidation of marital property, and much more. Unlike lawyers that you may know better, they do not represent one client, but they act for both parties more like mediators. So notaries are legally mandated by the Ministry of Justice and as such are agents of the state whose role is to serve the public. The paradox is that they collect tax and at the same time they advise their clients in matter of tax optimization. So notaries are agents of the Ministry of Justice, but they are hardly civil servants. For one thing, they can buy, sell, and transfer their practices. Being a notary also permits them to have a commercial function as consultants for which they can set their own fees. Regardless of the type of service, they have a duty to advise. In principle, notaries have to explain all possible options to their clients, as well as the consequences of the documents that they will sign. So we met notaries in different parts of France, in big cities, in Paris, as well as in the country. We show in the book that depending on the social background of their clientele, they offer different services according to the level of wealth of their clients. Notaries have the predominant role in successions, since only 5% of successions are taken to court in France. This means that the vast majority of family assets distributions upon the occasion of a death happens in the offices of notaries. Notaries are fond of presenting themselves as asset doctors or guarantors of family peace. This is something very important for our demonstration later. So we also studied the work of family lawyers. Lawyers represent their clients in court or by privately ordering their affairs. Although notaries' offices are the main site for implementing the law governing the circulation of family assets, lawyers also regularly get involved. Their mission is to defend their clients' rights. Like notaries, lawyers are self-employed and their work is heavily regulated. The state entrusting lawyers with a monopoly of the defense of private individuals and businesses in the court. However, the profession of notaries and lawyers are both even more strictly controlled by their respective professional organizations. Unlike notaries, lawyers set their own fees, except in the case of legal aid clients whose cases are paid for according to a national rate. We show also that the lawyer-client relationship, from cooperation to delegation, takes different forms in different social classes, depending on the size of law firms, the social economic background of the clients, and the way lawyers are paid, the amount of their fees, and the legal aid vouchers. So, we define family wealth arrangement as the oftentimes laborious and or conflictual consensus building process among family members and legal professionals over the appraisal and distribution of family wealth, as well as the outcome of this process. We use this term to designate situations with tensions that are not resolved by a unilateral imposition of one point of view, the law of the strongest, nor by a harmonious accord arising from family relations where everyone seems to agree, one common point of view. Arrangements require multiple people, they cannot be made by one person, and several points of view that need to be reconciled. From a temporal perspective, arrangements are never completely finished. Making arrangements is a perpetual process that outlasts their legal and moral formalization, whose results are only temporary. This concept goes beyond the legal opposition between agreement and contention by providing a finer description of the social production of consensus, including when the latter is fragile and temporary. The closed doors of the notaries' and lawyers' offices are what make it possible for clients and their counsel to come to these arrangements in the shadow of the law. So this expression was used by two American law professors, Nukin and Kornhauser, who showed the influence of case law on divorces, even undisputed ones, that were negotiated between lawyers. In their study, the prospect of going to court, which the spouses were trying by all means to avoid through negotiation, strongly limited the demands of both parties. Here, we adapt this expression, this concept, and we expand this notion to highlight the extent to which the family wealth arrangements formalized by lawyers and notaries at the time of divorce and succession are based in the law and meet its requirements, but also make it possible to work around or even evade the spirit of the law. The work of notaries and lawyers exacerbates economic inequality between social classes by aiding and abetting the maintenance and transfer of wealth within the most affluent family, while simultaneously serving to conceal, endorse, and legitimate the gender wealth gap. So to understand that, we have to study how legal professionals count. Okay, so now I have to explain what we called reversed accounting. So in successions, reversed accounting is an instrument that allows notaries to validate wealth arrangements that are part of family strategies of reproduction, all the while purporting to be in compliance with the law. So I explain it. So what you have to the left, like formalized accounting, is what we see in notary documents. So when you have a notary document, like concerning a succession or a divorce, like the moment when people share their wealth assets, in the document you have an inventory. Basically, an inventory, it's a list of assets that can be banking accounts or real estate properties or professional assets, businesses. So you have a list. And then in front of each item, you have a valuation of the assets, an amount of euros. So you think that what notaries do is like to do a sum of it and then a division, and then everyone has his or her own part share of it, okay? And if need be, you have compensations in euros. So we read many of these notary documents, and the logic of the document is this one, right? So a list, addition, division, right? And then we realized that it took us like several years, that once I will say it, it will be completely obvious. We realized that in practice, it was exactly the opposite. First, when people come to the notary office, they build a consensus on the distribution of assets. Who gets what? This is obvious. When a couple divorces, they know if the man or the woman will stay in the conjugal home. They already know it. And it's the same thing for succession. People already know who will get the family business or who will get the family house. So the consensus, the distribution is first. It comes first. And what happens in the notary office is like the negotiation of the compensation for those who have no assets or assets of lesser values. And also establishing the inventory and the valuation of the asset ex post in accordance with the law. So here you see that inventory and valuation comes next. So that's why we call it reversed accounting. So now I have to try to explain to you why this reversed accounting is sexist accounting, which means it's défavorable to women. This is the next step of the demonstration. Reversed accounting is a discrete technique. It is discreetly implemented behind the closed doors of notaries' offices, and it is at the discretion of legal professionals versant in property rights. In other words, they may use it when necessary. The technical complexity of this type of accounting, expressed in complicated legal language, obscures its political stakes, which is the fact that it's sexist accounting. If reversed accounting contributes to the widening of the wealth gap between men and women, it is because all property is not equal. So you have to remember the first part of the demonstration made by Sibylle. You remember what she said. We saw that certain families have assets that must be kept. They are more symbolically and economically important and preferentially passed along to sons. Do you remember that? And she said also it differs on social classes. Like can be in the wealthiest family, it can be the Amazon stock in the Bezos family, for example, and she said also in some family it can be the family business, professional property, or sometimes only a family home. Okay, so each of these assets, we describe them, she said that too, as structuring assets in the estate. They define the framework upon which legal professionals build family wealth arrangement. Reversed accounting makes these assets the starting point and keystone of all calculations. Once a notary knows who will get the structuring assets, so basically the family business or the family home, he or she establishes acceptable financial or in-kind compensation for the other heirs. Statistical data shows that only an eldest sons receive more of these structuring assets. That was what Sibylle said. As well as more gifts in advance than daughters or subsequent sons. So our observations in notaries' offices demonstrate that this distribution of family wealth, structuring assets for some, payoff for the others, is far from being economically egalitarian. Only through subtle accounting ploys do the amounts appear to be equal in the formal documents prepared by notaries and in statistical surveys. So the next question is, why do notaries act like this? Okay, so here we have, so I won't be too long, but we have to deal with the question, who are the notaries, basically? So notaries generally have a gendered and socially situated conception of the rightful heir, and that fits that of propertied families that are their best clients. They are particularly attached to ensuring the continuity of family businesses because they themselves come from families that owned their own business and profited from significant gifts or of professional assets in order to practice there. The social proximity between these notaries and these good clients is remarkable. They are all people with property who share a common interest in the preservation of wealth over time and its transfer in the family. The profession of notary is still an inheritance-based profession. Notarial practices are indeed rare, the number and location are regulated by the state, and costly to acquire, running 400,000 to 1 million euros depending on the location and its annual turnover. So we met 13 male and 4 female notaries who agreed to do with us in-depth interview. They were aged between 30 to over 60. They practiced in offices that were small or large, alone or with partners, etc., in a variety of geographical areas. We have detailed knowledge of the social backgrounds of 15 of them, and half of those had taken over the family office of a family member. 6 inherited it directly from their father or grandfather. 1 took over from his father-in-law, and another was the son of a notary who had joined another practice instead of taking over his father's. With only one exception, all came from families of self-employed or business-owning parents. So their parents or in-laws were doctors, pharmacists, restaurant, hotel keepers, bakers, farmers, wine grape growers, appraiser, etc. And they set up their practice in their home region. Those with children nearing the end of their education generally wondered about passing their practice on. So the economic morality of such family, which try to pass their entire professional property on to one of theirs, if possible the one of the most apt to make the business flourish, thus aligns with the economic morality of these professionals of property law. Do the legal professionals that we followed consciously try to favor men over women? The question of intentionality is probably not the right one to ask. Reversed accounting is what Pierre Bourdieu calls a logic of practice, an incorporated system of dispositions that, without forming an intention, is nonetheless able to orient practices in an unconscious and systematic way. Gendered representations of the social order run throughout this mode of accounting, around the definition of the rightful heir and the good business owner, the reasonable widow and the good mother, and the conception of which property should be passed down the family line and which may be passed along to a wife. Economic transfers between relatives bear the traces of this subconscious sexism incorporated into the very ways that notaries and lawyers calculate, that conceal and legitimize them under the law. If lawyers and notaries calculate this way, it is mainly because they are trying to build a consensus to protect family relations. So remember what I say, like we have family doctors, asset doctors. So building a consensus is at the core of their practice, of their professional practice. So here are pictures, maybe like this long discourse, and it's maybe easier to see through pictures. These are pictures from the website, the official website of French notaries. On the pages, inheritance and gifts and family businesses. So you can see the conception of transmission into the family. And I swear that and you can check, it's been like 2 years that we show these pictures now, and they are not the equivalent with the pink background and mothers and daughters. But see, we traveled a little bit with this book, and we realized that it was basically the same in Germany and also in Belgium. And of course, I checked before coming here about Switzerland. So I was a bit sad that in the German-speaking side of Switzerland, there were no pictures at all. But les notaires romans I was happy to find those pictures. And I was also happy to see this couple. I mean, it's the first time that on a notary website, I see like a couple represented on the page about succession. But basically, you see it's more about like a male profession, and yeah. Okay, so now the last part. It's the very last idea about a subject that we didn't speak at all about, which is super important, which is tax. So in the book, we show the central role of taxation in producing the family peace, which can take very different forms depending on class backgrounds, but which is usually unfavorable to women. This is the demonstration we make in the book. So what is this picture? Of course, it's a funny picture of Sarah Persglove. So she's the wife of a Finnish entrepreneur, Robert Österlund. And she had the great luck of having the Panama Papers scandal erupt during her divorce proceedings in Canada. She and her lawyers discovered that her husband had a fortune worth $400 million, US dollars, much more than the few millions he claimed. Good for her. So their in-depth investigation in connection with the divorce led them to deconstruct the arcana of the financial empire composed of offshore companies, trusts in the Cook Islands, and shell corporations in the Bahamas and other tax havens worldwide. So, of course, this kind of international scale financial engineering only concerns the greatest fortunes. But as we have seen, many wives, daughters, and sisters of businessmen, members of the professions, and even shopkeepers and farmers may, at the time of divorce or succession, find themselves not knowing exactly what the family net worth is. When this happens, they have trouble asserting their rights of the wealth that they can barely measure or get acknowledged. Tax optimization, concealment, and sometimes outright fraud, like here, implemented by legal and financial management professionals, block the legal compensation mechanism serving women who are kept away from wealth management. However, the effectiveness of the production of ignorance in family wealth arrangements depends on the degree of sophistication of the tools used to trick the tax administration. At the pinnacle of the social economic hierarchy, wealth belongs to men. Women are distinctly underrepresented among the very rich, CEOs, and even the professions and small business owners. The higher the net worth, the more likely it is that it is managed exclusively by men. So this table here is from Camille Erlingiré's book. I really recommend this book. It's in French. It's called Rester riche. She describes the relationship that women in wealthy families have with their wealth as property without appropriation. She did something very simple here. So it's the French Wealth Survey, so the one we were speaking about just before, and she checked who answered the survey. And the people responsible of the survey asked that it is the most knowledgeable of the management of household assets who should answer among interviewed couples. And here you can see that the richest the family, the more often it's a man who answers the survey alone, which says something about like this production of ignorance of women on family issues in very wealthy families where the wealth is super complicated because a lot of legal professionals are involved to make it complicated to pay less tax. Okay, you got the ideas. So wives are often, and especially like wives of very rich men, are often unaware of their household's economic situation or that of their husbands, whom they entrust with most financial administrative tasks, particularly income tax declarations. And we saw that studying the moment of divorce, these women discovering that they knew nothing about the wealth of their couple. The Gilets jaunes movement, on the other side, brought the media spotlight to working class people it had previously ignored. Headlines focused on women who camped out at traffic circles and highway toll and lead demonstration under the sharp eyes of the aggressive police. A number of them were raising their children alone and had a hard time balancing the family budget. They told reporters their stories of unpaid child support and never-ending paperwork to apply for limited public assistance. They spoke of their constant struggle to pay the bills of putting their children's needs before their own. They spoke of unemployment, part-time jobs, having to take on as many work hours as possible. Some of these women had given up on wage employment altogether and had become self-employed, but it didn't pay any better. And then there were retired women, often widows with meager pensions. So my point here is to say that in poor families, money problems are women's problems, whereas in rich families, as you can see here, it's men's power. Okay, a few words to conclude this too long talk. 3 points that we would like to make with Sibylle. The first one, how tax policy can fight wealth inequality. There are plenty of propositions in France, especially I think here about like Piketty's team and Thomas Piketty himself asking for more tax on wealth and on wealthy people. So of course we agree with that. That one result of our work is to show that people who own capital, who have a lot of wealth, they also have many resources to maintain their social status. And these are mostly men, if we want to keep things together. So it's not only, you don't have to think only on tax policy, but you also have to think on all these professionals who are involved, like, as I mentioned, notaries, they are the ones who collect taxes on succession and on divorces. And at the same time, they are the ones advising their best clients, their wealthiest clients, to pay less tax. So you see that we also have to take that into account into this conversation about tax policy. Then we have a methodological issue, which is like there is the research on the gender wealth gap will improve worldwide only if we have better data. And we have a big problem here, which is the household. Margaret Marveni, she spoke a lot about that. Like the fact that the household, c'est un cache-sexe, elle disait, like a fig leaf on economic inequality between men and women. So we need to have better data and individual data on wealth to better measure this gender wealth gap. My last point is that, of course, here it's very easy to say that, and everybody, I guess, is convinced already that gender is at the heart of the contemporary class-based society. And the point we make here is that you cannot think about class without gender, and not about gender without class. But avenues of research for an intersectional approach of wealth inequality is to go beyond that and to include also age, but also sexuality and also race, which is particularly difficult to do in France. But we hope that this research will lead to plenty of other ones on this question in an intersectional way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have now time for some questions.